Welcome to the Archives. In this video we will continue our lecture on the Peloponnesian War and focus specifically on hoplite warfare, or rather, how the Greek armies fought each other in pitched land battles. And this lecture is going to cover how the hoplites represented their city-state, equipment they used, how they fought, and how their tactics changed as the Peloponnesian War dragged on. Hoplite was the name of the heavy infantry in the Greek army. They were referred to as heavy infantry because they wore heavy armor, as opposed to light infantry, which wore almost no armor. They were soldiers that trained, fought, and were the overall representation for the Greek army. The ones that were allowed to fight as hoplites were middle to upper class citizens, and this was because they actually had to pay for their own weapons and equipment. They weren't just supplied with this, they had to pay for it on their own out of their own pocket. The hoplites fought in a phalanx formation, where men fought together as one united force against their enemy. Citizens who bravely fought in the phalanx were considered honorable, and they gained a voice in the assembly. The entire force received recognition for victory, or even a valiant defeat. For example, in 440 BCE, 40 years after the Battle of Thermopylae, all 300 Spartans who died in that battle, their names were engraved on a column that was erected at Leonidas' tomb. Leonidas was the king that led them into battle during the Battle of Thermopylae. And the names of every single Spartan was engraved onto that column at his grave. So that was holding them to the same amount of honor as their commanding officer. But there's also an innovation that occurred in 464 BCE. In Athens, funeral orations were held, which glorified the entire city-state, in this case Athens, for a victory that they achieved during that battle. So, funeral orations would occur after a battle was either won or lost, or could have been a stalemate. A funeral was given on soldiers whose lives were lost during that battle, and during this oration, the orator would glorify the city, talk about the things that they fought for and that they didn't die in vain. Now, by the mid-5th century, the Greek city-state that had the greatest army was Sparta, because they professionally trained their hoplites from childhood to adulthood. We'll go more into that when we get into the lecture on Sparta. The hoplites had to be heavily armored to defend against attackers. They would have a bronze chestplate and backplate, a bronze helmet with a plume on top that usually was made up of horsehair, and the helmet would cover the backs of their skull, the sides, and on the front there'd be just a small opening for the mouth and slits for the eyes. Refer to this as a Corinthian-style helmet. They also wore greaves, that covered the shins, the calves, and the knees, and went from the tops of the knees all the way down to the ankles. Now, as for their weapons, they were given a shield, also known as a hoplon, which was very important to the Greek hoplite. That's what the hoplite is named after, because their other weapons, like the spear and the sword, are used to defend themselves, but the shield is used to defend the entire Greek phalanx. Now, the hoplite shield was about 15 to 20 pounds, so one of the great inventions they added to it was the sleeve. It's located on the inside, right in the center of the shield. And the hoplite would slip his arm through the sleeve to hold on to the handle, which was out on the outer edge, as you can see here in the image. And the sleeve was important because it allowed the hoplite to bear the entire weight with their entire arm, as opposed to a shield that would only have the handle at the center. It also made it difficult for the enemy to take the shield because it was really well braced, not just in one place, but two. They also had a 7 to 8 foot long spear known as a dory that was equipped with a spearhead made of iron and a butt spike made of bronze. And the butt spike was used so that they could stick it into the ground when they weren't using it. The sword they used was referred to as a kopis, and this was a secondary weapon. Their spear was the primary weapon. It's what they typically used, and they almost never went to their swords. Usually they only went to their swords if their spear was completely lost. This was still rare. There's one passage in Herodotus where he mentions the fight of the 300, where the 300 fought for their lives after they had been cut off and surrounded. They actually had to bring their swords out to defend themselves from the Persians. It was usually highly irregular. Most Greek city-states used a kopis, or cleaver, which was a slashing sword with the blade on one end. But the Spartans used a straight sword that was short. It's said to be maybe a bit more than 12 inches long, at least the blade. And what this signified was that the Spartan was willing to get really close to their enemy to kill them if they lost their spear. So aside from a weapon, it was also a symbol of Spartan bravery. Aside from the hoplites, there were also a type of light infantry known as the peltast. These were usually from underdeveloped Greek city-states. For example, the Chalcidice and regions in central Greece like Acarnania. They were lightly armored. They used shields called a pelti, which were much lighter than the hoplon. They wore little to no armor, and they were given a javelin or a sling and a short sword to defend themselves, because they had to rely on mobility to pelt the opponent with weapons from a distance, instead of having to stand up and march toward their opponent like a typical hoplite would. Hoplites, on the other hand, they didn't throw their spears. They only used them for thrusting, because their spears were very important to the phalanx. Now, the structure of the phalanx was generally the size was between 4 to 6 files wide, maybe 8 ranks deep, and the shields were the most important factor of that phalanx, because when a Spartan soldier was holding their shield on their left arm, their right side was left open. So they had to rely on the Spartan to their right for their shield to cover them, so that when they stood in a line, all their shields would overlap like snake scales. Now, with this formation, that left the very end of the right side of the line exposed. But this was considered a position of honor, because they'd have to rely on no one but themselves to defend the phalanx if they were attacked from that position. The first 3 ranks of the phalanx were tasked with attacking the enemy that was attacking them. And they would have to hold their spears upright overhand and stab downward. Historians refer to this as sloping the spears, since they're held at that downward angle. And there is some debate on whether they were held overhand or underhand. From my research, and also from having practiced this while practicing with weapons, overhand is much less strenuous for the wrist, and also our earliest depictions of hoplites can clearly be seen as holding the spears overhand. And this is from the Chigi vase, which was made in Corinth in the 7th century. And this is our earliest depiction of how hoplites fought in hoplite warfare. And especially after having practiced with the spear, it's much less strenuous to be holding it overhand than it is to hold it underhand, and like having to bend your wrist up to thrust it. So I vote for holding it overhand as the most efficient method. The last 5 ranks had 2 jobs. One was to continue to push the 3 ranks in front of them as they were marching, and they would push and shove them with their shields to make sure that they couldn't run away. The other job was to kill a downed enemy with the butt spike of their spear. So as an enemy was down by the front ranks, and they started marching over them, to make sure that they couldn't be attacked while they were laying on the ground, the back 5 ranks would thrust their spears downward with the butt spike of their spear into their armor and finish them off to make sure that they stayed dead. Now, the advantages of the phalanx was that it had a strong frontal defense. There was almost nothing getting through them unless it was another hoplite force. And from the time of the beginning of the 5th century, the best that opponents could do when attacking in front was to attack them with another phalanx, because their armor was too thick and their shields were too thick to be attacked with arrows. The second advantage it had was that it was really effective against cavalry, because a rider can get their horse to do a lot of things, but a horse is not stupid enough to run toward a bronze shield wall with various spears jutting out toward it, because you're not going to get a horse to run to their death. Now, this doesn't mean that it didn't have its fair share of disadvantages. For one, it only functioned on flat plains. Two sides waging battle against each other actually had to agree on a flat plain, a place where there was a flat, open plain during the daytime to where they could wage the war. It wasn't effective in forests. It had to be a flat, open plain. It wasn't very maneuverable except for moving forward and possibly back. It couldn't really turn without wheeling the entire phalanx. Like the entire unit would have to move as one, because the younger men in the phalanx would always be stationed in front, while the older ones were stationed in back ranks. So they couldn't just lift up their spears right face and continue marching with that phalanx while going to the right. They'd have to wheel, which took a lot of time, and the hoplites on the outside of the wheel would have to march faster than the ones on the inside. And the last issue that would have is something known as phalanx drift. And that's when, since all these soldiers are huddled together side by side and having to keep safe by staying close to the person to their right, the hoplites would start to huddle together and favor the right side more as they marched forward. And that caused a chain reaction throughout the entire phalanx, which would cause it to drift to the right as it was marching forward. And on the downside, there's a bit of an upside and downside to this. On the downside, it would open up a hole in their rank if, let's say, the phalanx next to them wasn't affected with the hoplite, with that phalanx drift. But the upside is, by drifting more to the right, they would be able to attack that position on their enemy's flank that much easier. So there's a bit of a give-take when it comes to phalanx drift. Now, archers, for the most part, we hear that the Athenians did use archers in the phalanx, but we don't exactly know how they were incorporated into the phalanx. And as far as cavalry goes, Athens, Sparta, and especially Boeotia and Thessaly used horse cavalry, but they relied more on the Greek heavy infantry, and that's because it was really effective against horses. At Marathon, the Greek soldiers actually charged against the Persian cavalry and forced them back, because the Persian cavalry was so stunned to see troops that were unmounted just charging toward them. This is how a typical phalanx battle really went before the Peloponnesian War, and in some cases during the Peloponnesian War. Battle was agreed upon a flat, open plain, as I said earlier. It would have to be daylight, and the forces would set up their lines and columns. Each phalanx would set themselves up, and phalanx were typically divided by platoon, at least for the Spartan side, and the forces would set up their lines and columns. The two sides would march toward each other, and as soon as they made contact, they clashed, shoved, stabbed, and blocked. Just typical battle. This usually went on for an hour until one side would be routed, and the usual way that this would happen would be each side's left wing would try to flank the opponent's right, because that was where they were open the most. It's also usually where the commander was located as well. There were other ways that the phalanx would win. For example, if one side killed enough opposing hoplites to reduce the phalanx structure. And there's also the chance that one side would start marching toward them, and the other side would flee in fear before they even clashed. Once the enemy was routed, the victors would not pursue them. That was absolute key, that they would not chase after them as they were running. After the battle, the defeated would send a herald to the battle and a request to gather their dead. This was absolutely important, that the victors respect this custom, because to not allow them to bring their dead home, that wasn't just seen as impious, it was also dishonorable. The soldier dies in battle, they still need to be brought home, and it was disapproved upon not just by the military, but by the assembly and the people of that city-state as well. Once the dead had been gathered, the victors would set up a trophy at the point where the defeated had ran away. So they usually set up this trophy. A trophy, it's not like the trophy we usually think of. It's wooden posts that would be dressed in the enemy's armor. And that was usually indications to indicate to everybody else, this is exactly where this army was routed at the battle that took place here. Now, there were various differences in land warfare, or rather changes, if you will, that went on before or during the Peloponnesian War. First of all, before the Peloponnesian War, the Hoplites were just viewed as unbeatable because they were so strong against the Persian cavalry, and they put up such a strong defense. Many Greek city-states viewed this and just said, well, it's like nobody can beat these guys. But then during the Peloponnesian War, the light infantry, and particularly the peltasts in central Greece, were very good at attacking hoplites because they fought in forests. So light infantry really started to shine by the time of the Peloponnesian War. It's also a time in Greek history when light infantry starts to get more valued. Major battle victories by land or sea would determine the outcome of a war. For example, the Persian War, victory was determined by its many victories in Salamis, and Plataea, and Mycale, and those victories just led to the end of the Persian War in the Greeks' favor. In the Peloponnesian War, however, major battle victories didn't really determine who won at the end. Both Sparta and Athens would achieve strong victories by land and sea, but the war continued to drag on for 27 years. There's even one point in, I'd say, 425 BCE, where the Athenians had achieved a strong victory at an area called Pylos. And they managed to capture over 100 Spartans, but despite that, the entire war wasn't ended after that. It didn't even that phase of the war was ended on a stalemate between the Spartans and the Athenians. So a major battle victory didn't determine the very end of the war. And last but not least, there's the ideal of a mutual Greek respect for the war ethos. The whole rules of war, like not attacking civilians, not attacking the enemy's crops, and, of course, as mentioned earlier, allowing the victors to gather dead. Well, that ethos was violated on multiple occasions, and it happened so often in the Peloponnesian War that it was almost common to violate it's almost as if there was no war ethos. Crops were destroyed as a part of strategy. Civilians were killed let me put it this way. Usually whether it be Sparta or Athens, if they conquered an island or a city-state, their typical punishment during the Peloponnesian War is to kill off all the men and sell the women and children into slavery. So that wasn't really respected. So civilian life wasn't really respected in this time of war, and there was no such thing as neutrality in the Peloponnesian War. Also, there were instances where the dead was not allowed to be gathered, or possibly have forgotten to be gathered, and this part of it usually didn't come without consequences. If they didn't go and gather their dead, even the officers, even at a naval battle, if they didn't gather their dead, the assembly would give them hell for it. Now, for our Chronicle for All Time, for this lecture, we're going to go over some formation fighting. Now, the list for how many armies and civilizations have used formation fighting is miles long, so I'm going to focus on two. The first is the Roman testudo formation, which means tortoise, that was used in the 1st century, and the European pike and shot that was used in early modern Europe in areas like the 30 Years' War and the English Civil War. All of these were formations that required cohesion. Everyone had to work together to function as one specific unit. The testudo was used as a sieging apparatus in a way, because the Romans would approach a fortress with their shields, everybody's shields covering them in the front, the top, and the sides so that enemy arrows and javelins would just deflect right off the shield as they were advancing toward the front gates. And the European pike and shot, the formations would have the soldiers with their muskets fire, and then while they were reloading, the pikemen would move up and hold their pikes out to defend against any cavalry that was coming their way. So all these were formations that had a strong reliance on discipline, and they had to be practiced rigorously in order to get them right, and make sure that no pikes banged into each other, or that no one misstepped or even fell over. They were drilled and rehearsed, and so that when they went on the field, they would be most effective, just like the Greek phalanx. Okay, I hope you all enjoyed this lecture, and if you have any questions, comments, concerns, or criticisms, you can leave that in the comments. The next lecture, we're going to be covering the Greek Navy, and I hope you all stay safe, stay healthy, stay awesome, and I'll see you next time.